For over a century, we've told ourselves a story about Neanderthals. They were primitive, brutish, less intelligent than us, evolutionary dead ends who couldn't adapt, couldn't compete, and ultimately deserved to go extinct. We used their name as an insult, called someone a Neanderthal, and you meant they were stupid, crude, uncivilized. Museums displayed them hunched over, dragging clubs, grunting at each other like animals. Textbooks taught that Homo sapiens, us, were simply better, smarter, more evolved, and for decades that story went unchallenged. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We were wrong. Spectacularly, completely wrong. New discoveries over the past 20 years have shattered everything we thought we knew about Neanderthals. And what's emerging is a picture of a species far more sophisticated, far more intelligent, and far more human than anyone imagined. They created art. They buried their dead with ceremony. They cared for the sick and elderly. They made jewelry. They may have had language as complex as ours. And they survived for 400,000 years, longer than modern humans have even existed. So why did we get them so wrong? And what does that say about how we judge intelligence itself? This is the story of the Neanderthals. The species we underestimated, the cousins we lost, and the part of ourselves we're only now beginning to understand. The dates and evolutionary relationships described in this video, including shared ancestry between Neanderthals and modern humans, reflect current scientific interpretations that continue to evolve. The first Neanderthal skeleton was discovered in 1856 in a limestone quarry in the Neander Valley of Germany. Workers found bones, strange bones, a skull with a thick brow ridge, limbs that seemed heavy, robust, nothing like the skeletons of modern humans they were familiar with. Scientists at the time didn't know what to make of it. Charles Darwin hadn't even published On the Origin of Species yet. The idea that humans had evolutionary cousins was radical, controversial, almost heretical. Some scholars argued the bones belonged to a deformed human. Others claimed it was a Cossack soldier who died during the Napoleonic Wars. One anatomist suggested it was simply someone with rickets and arthritis. But as more skeletons were found, across Europe, in caves buried in sediment, it became clear this was something else, a different kind of human, an extinct species that had once lived alongside our ancestors. And that's when the problems began, because the scientists who studied these bones in the late 1800s brought their own prejudices with them. They saw the thick skulls, the heavy brows, the robust bodies, and they interpreted all of it through a lens of Victorian racism and social Darwinism. To them, these features meant one thing: primitive, inferior, less evolved. Early reconstructions portrayed Neanderthals as hunched, ape-like, knuckle-dragging brutes. Museums displayed them with exaggerated features, sloping foreheads, jutting jaws, vacant expressions. The name Neanderthal became synonymous with stupidity. If you wanted to insult someone's intelligence, you called them a caveman, a Neanderthal. This image was reinforced for generations. Textbooks, popular culture, movies and cartoons. Neanderthals were the evolutionary losers, the species that failed because they weren't smart enough to compete with us, the superior Homo sapiens. And for more than a century that story held. But it was built on bad science, cultural bias, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence actually looks like. Because the more we study Neanderthals, with modern tools, unbiased analysis, and a willingness to question our assumptions, the more we realize they weren't primitive at all. They were us, just a different version. Let's start with the basics. Who were the Neanderthals, really? Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, evolved in Europe around 400,000 years ago. For context, modern humans, Homo sapiens, didn't appear until about 300,000 years ago. That means Neanderthals existed as a species longer than we have. They lived across Europe and Western Asia, from Spain to Siberia. They adapted to Ice Age climates, surviving in environments that would kill an unprepared human today. Freezing winters, scarce food, predators like cave bears and hyenas. And they thrived. Anatomically, they were different from us, but not in the ways early scientists thought. Yes, they had thicker bones, larger brow ridges, broader noses, shorter, stockier builds, but these weren't signs of primitiveness. They were adaptations. Cold weather adaptations, specifically. The wide nose warmed frigid air before it reached the lungs. The robust skeleton supported powerful muscles needed for hunting large game in harsh terrain. And here's the part that surprises people. Neanderthal brains were larger than ours. On average, a Neanderthal brain was about 1,300 to 1,700 cubic centimeters. Modern human brains average around 1,350. Now, brain size doesn't directly equal intelligence. We know that, but it does suggest that the idea of Neanderthals as dim-witted brutes is nonsense. They weren't less evolved, they were differently evolved, adapted to different environments, different challenges, and for tens of thousands of years, they coexisted with Homo sapiens. Starting around 60,000 years ago, modern humans began migrating out of Africa and into Europe and Asia, Neanderthal territory. For at least 10,000 years, the two species lived side by side. They encountered each other, traded, possibly, fought sometimes, and they interbred. We know this because of DNA. In 2010, scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and they found something remarkable. 1 to 4% of the DNA in non-African modern humans comes from Neanderthals. That means if your ancestors came from Europe, Asia, or the Americas, you carry Neanderthal genes. They're not a separate species that went extinct. They're part of us, literally. So the question isn't whether Neanderthals were intelligent. The question is, why did it take us so long to see it? If Neanderthals were as primitive as we once believed, the archaeological record should reflect that. We'd find crude tools, simple shelters, no art, no culture, but that's not what we find. Instead, we find evidence of a species with cognitive abilities that rival, and in some cases exceed, those of early Homo sapiens. Let's start with tools. Neanderthals used a sophisticated stone-working technique called the Levallois method. It's a prepared core technique where you carefully shape a stone, then strike it to produce multiple sharp flakes with predetermined shapes. It requires planning, spatial reasoning, an understanding of physics, angles, force, material properties. This wasn't crude. This was engineering. They also controlled fire, not just opportunistically using natural fires, but creating fire on demand, choosing specific woods for different purposes, using fire for cooking, warmth, light, and even processing materials like birch bark to make tar, a sticky adhesive used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch tar requires heating bark in an oxygen-deprived environment at precise temperatures. It's chemistry. And Neanderthals were doing it 200,000 years ago. Then there's burial. Neanderthals buried their dead. Not always. Burial requires effort, and not every death warranted it. But at sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France and Shanidar Cave in Iraq, we've found intentional graves. Some graves contained flowers. Pollen analysis shows clusters of medicinal plants placed with the bodies. Whether this was ritual, respect, or something else, it shows symbolic thought, an awareness of death, possibly even a concept of an afterlife. At Shanidar Cave, one skeleton belonged to an older male with severe injuries, a crushed skull, a withered arm, likely blind in one eye. He couldn't have survived alone. The group cared for him, fed him, protected him. That's not brutish, that's compassion. Neanderthals also made jewelry. At sites in Italy and Spain, archaeologists have found shells with holes drilled through them, clearly meant to be strung as necklaces or bracelets. Eagle talons with cut marks worn as pendants. These aren't functional objects. They're decorative, aesthetic, cultural, and then there's art. In 2018, scientists dated cave paintings in Spain, handprints, abstract shapes, red ochre markings, to more than 64,000 years ago. That's at least 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. Those paintings were made by Neanderthals. It proves symbolic thinking, abstract representation, the ability to create meaning beyond survival. They also had language. We can't know exactly what it sounded like, but we have clues. Neanderthals had the same hyoid bone that modern humans do, the bone that supports the tongue and larynx, essential for complex speech. They also had the FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans is critical for language development. The Neanderthal version is nearly identical to ours. Could they speak? Almost certainly. Did they have complex language, stories, songs? We don't know, but the evidence suggests they could have. So here's what we're looking at. A species that made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, created art, buried their dead with ceremony, cared for the vulnerable, wore jewelry, and likely had language. That's not primitive. That's human. If Neanderthals were so capable, so intelligent, why did they go extinct? Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals began disappearing from the archaeological record. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone, and Homo sapiens, us, survived. For a long time, the assumption was simple. We outcompeted them. We were smarter, more adaptable, better at everything. They couldn't keep up, so they died out. But that narrative doesn't hold up anymore, because extinction isn't about being better or worse. It's about circumstance, timing, and luck. Let's look at the theories. Theory 1. Competition with Homo sapiens. When modern humans migrated into Europe, they entered territory that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. There was overlap, competition for resources, food, shelter, territory. Some researchers argue that Homo sapiens had a slight edge. Maybe we were better at long-distance running, allowing us to hunt more efficiently. Maybe we had more complex social networks, enabling trade and cooperation across larger groups. Or maybe we were just more numerous. Neanderthal populations were always small. Estimates suggest no more than 70,000 individuals at their peak, spread across an entire continent. Homo sapiens had larger populations, and in evolutionary terms, numbers matter. More people means more genetic diversity, more innovation, more resilience. Theory 2. Climate change. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe experienced dramatic climate shifts. Temperatures dropped, glaciers expanded. The environment Neanderthals had adapted to for millennia was changing rapidly. Homo sapiens, coming from Africa, were more adaptable to different climates. Neanderthals, specialized for Ice Age Europe, may have struggled as conditions became unpredictable. It's also possible that climate change reduced prey populations. Neanderthals hunted large game, mammoths, woolly rhinos, reindeer. If those populations crashed, Neanderthals would have starved. Theory 3. Small population size and inbreeding. Genetic studies show that Neanderthals had low genetic diversity. Small, isolated populations tend to interbreed, accumulating harmful mutations over generations. This genetic bottleneck may have made them more vulnerable to disease, less adaptable to change, and ultimately less able to recover from population crashes. Theory 4. Disease. When Homo sapiens migrated into Europe, they may have brought diseases with them, pathogens that Neanderthals had never encountered and had no immunity to. Think of what happened when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Indigenous populations with no immunity to smallpox or measles were devastated. The same could have happened to Neanderthals. The reality is probably a combination of all these factors. Climate change weakened them. Disease struck. Competition with Homo sapiens added pressure. Small population sizes meant they couldn't bounce back. It wasn't that they were inferior. They were unlucky. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If the circumstances had been slightly different, it could have been us who went extinct, and Neanderthals who survived. Evolution doesn't favor the best. It favors the ones who happen to survive. Neanderthals didn't just disappear, they left something behind. When scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they didn't just discover that we share DNA, they discovered which genes we inherited and what they do. Some Neanderthal genes affect immune function. They help modern humans fight off certain viruses and bacterial infections. Without those genes, some of us would be more vulnerable to disease. Other genes influence skin and hair color. Red hair, for example, is more common in people of European descent, and that trait may have come from Neanderthals. There are also genes related to metabolism, fat storage, and adaptation to cold climates. Populations living at high altitudes like Tibetans carry Neanderthal genes that help them survive in low oxygen environments. In other words, Neanderthal DNA didn't just persist by accident. It persisted because it was useful. Natural selection kept those genes because they helped us survive, but it's not all beneficial. Some Neanderthal genes increase the risk of certain health conditions: diabetes, depression, autoimmune disorders. Evolution is messy. What helped Neanderthals survive in Ice Age Europe doesn't always help us today. Still, the point stands. They're not gone. They're part of us. Every time you look at someone with red hair or pale skin adapted to northern climates, or a robust immune system that fights off infections, you're looking at Neanderthal heritage. And that raises a philosophical question. If 1 to 4% of our DNA comes from Neanderthals, were they really a separate species? Or were they just a different population of humans? Like how people from different continents today look different, but are all Homo sapiens. Some scientists now argue that Neanderthals shouldn't be classified as Homo neanderthalensis, a separate species, but as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, a subspecies of humans. The line between species is blurrier than we thought, and that matters because it changes how we see them. They weren't others who lost to us. They were cousins, family, part of the same human story. Their extinction wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. Imagine what they might have contributed if they'd survived. What knowledge, culture, art, innovation. We'll never know. But we do know this. Underestimating them was a mistake. For a century, we judged their intelligence based on appearance, on prejudice, on assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence. We saw thick brows and assumed stupidity. We saw different and assumed inferior. And we were wrong. It's a lesson worth remembering, because if we got Neanderthals so wrong for so long, what else are we wrong about? How many other forms of intelligence, human or otherwise, do we fail to recognize because they don't look like ours? The Neanderthals weren't less intelligent than us. They weren't evolutionary failures. They weren't brutish cavemen. They were humans. Different, yes, but human. They survived for 400,000 years in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They created tools, art, culture. They cared for their sick and buried their dead. They adapted, innovated, and thrived. And when they disappeared, they didn't vanish completely. They became part of us. The story we told ourselves, that we were superior, that we won because we were better, was never true. We survived because of circumstance, luck, timing, and perhaps because we absorbed them. Their genes, their knowledge, their strength. The Neanderthals teach us humility. They remind us that intelligence takes many forms, that survival isn't about being the smartest, it's about adapting to the world you're in. They remind us to question our assumptions, to look at evidence without bias, to recognize that just because something is different doesn't mean it's less. And they remind us that history is written by the survivors. But that doesn't mean the survivors were better. It just means they were luckier. Somewhere in your DNA, if your ancestors came from outside Africa, there are Neanderthal genes. Genes that helped you survive. Genes that make you who you are. They didn't lose. They didn't fail. They're still here, in us. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Thank you for watching Hidden Archives. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Neanderthals, please like and subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about the past. Let me know in the comments, what surprised you most about Neanderthals? And what other misunderstood species should we explore next? See you in the next archive.